This program is brought to you by Pussy Magnets.
Put a midge on your friend with a pussy magnet.
Welcome, my lovely lumps. Or should I say lovely labs? I'm so thrilled to have you here in the Labia Lounge. We're going to yarn about all things sexuality, womanhood, relationships, intimacy, holistic health, and everything in between. Your legs. Ooh, can't help myself. Anyway, we're going to have vag loads of real chats with real people about real shit. So buckle up, you're about to receive the sex ed that you never had and have a bloody good laugh while you're at it. Before we dive in, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. It's an absolute privilege to be living and creating dope podcast content in Naarm, and I pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, if you're ready, let's flap and do this. Oh my God, is there such thing as too many vagina jokes in the one intro? Whatever, it's my podcast. I'm leaving it in.
Don't panic, you're not broken. Your sex education was a piece of shit. Get your flaps out and pull up a couch. It's the Labia Lounge.
Hey gang, just before we jump into this episode, I wanted to offer you an opportunity to access my new mini course for free before I start charging for it in future. It's for people with vulvas and it's quick to complete. It's all about demystifying the female body and pleasure anatomy and getting some basic fundamentals to understand your body better. It's called Pussy Pleasure Secrets, Your Roadmap to Bedroom Bliss. You can grab it on the freebies page of my website or in the show notes. It's a great little free resource to kind of dip your toe in or act as a bit of a taster for my work. So if you've ever been curious about this sort of thing and you just don't know where to start, or you want a really quick, easy, accessible, non-threatening way to get the ball rolling and start working on this stuff, this is a great place to start. Hey labial lovers, welcome back to the lounge. Today I have probably a guest who's been on the most out of anyone, maybe even Hannah. I don't know. What do you reckon? Is this our 4th episode, Jojo?
I think we might be up to number 4 now. Yeah.
Not playing favourites here, but yeah, Joanna has just got so much extensive knowledge, and there's generally things that we're nerding out on, and we're like, hey, should we just do a podcast about it? So today we're going to be talking about UTIs. And in case you haven't listened to any of our previous episodes, Joanna's been on before talking about thrush, UTIs, and bacterial vaginosis like over 2 years ago. And then we did an amazing episode about the pill, and another one about menopause. So feel free to check those out with Joanna Macmeikan. Wait, am I saying that right? I should know.
Yeah, you are. Actually, well done. Most people will struggle.
All right, cool. That would have been embarrassing. And Joanna is a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, women's health and hormone specialist, all around fucking nerd, and I love it. So welcome back, Joanna.
Yeah, I think big nerd should be on my bio somewhere. Thanks for having me back. This is a topic that's really close to my heart because this is actually what kind of sent me through personal experience down the rabbit hole of the vaginal microbiome, and then that directed me into the work I do now with menopause and perimenopause because of my own journey with a recurrent UTI.
Yeah, not much fun. Hey, so I'm stoked to be talking to you now, that because I think that when we first chatted, maybe you hadn't had all of this personal experience with the recurrent UTIs. That's kind of been happening more in recent
No,
times.
I had it. So I suppose that's a good place to start. Is I'll just give a little bit of we need to, you know, in Scooby Doo where they go like woo 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 and they give you the backstory. I reckon it's like 7 years ago now that I'd always had UTIs on and off during my life. Like even when I was a little girl, I remember my mum would give me citrovescent or Ural. So, and I didn't know at the time why I was having it, but I must have said to her like it hurts when I pee or something. So I definitely had a history of these urinary symptoms. And then when I can't remember if my first one with antibiotics, most likely it would have been after I became sexually active. And the pattern I would get is I would get one and then it would hang around for a while, and I'd need multiple rounds of antibiotics. It would be tough to get rid of, and then it would go away, and it would go away for years, and then it would come back, and I'd be in this recurrent state again. And it was often when I traveled, I did notice certain patterns. So scented toilet paper seemed to set me off, or at least I thought it did. Now, 7 years down the track, my case was like a multi-layered onion situation, and I think there are a lot of people who are in a similar situation. It's not the way I experienced this journey, is not the way everyone experiences it. Recurrent UTIs can be quite complex and quite broad as to what's driving it. But yeah, there were these triggers that I would notice, and if I'd had like a sexy weekend where I'd got it on multiple times in a row, then that was like surefire going to be a problem. But it wasn't until 7 years ago, and I was like married by then, that I went out for my birthday, and we went to a Japanese restaurant, and I had a nice meal. I drank some sake. Alcohol used to be a trigger as well. And I had lots of birthday cake, so sugar as well. And I got one, and I was like, oh man, I hadn't had one for years. And that was to date the most persistent one that I had. And it was, I would get rid of it for 2 weeks, and then it would come back. I'd try and treat it naturally because, of course, I knew more about holistic health. My history of UTIs was before I went back to university to study in health sciences. And first I did naturopathy, and then I transferred over to Chinese medicine. So I was trying to treat it naturally and holistically, and it wasn't working. So then I go and get antibiotics, and I'd be like, right, antibiotics clears it up, and then I would do the mop up afterwards. But it wasn't working. And if I just had a coffee, if I had a glass of wine, if I had sex, just bam, I was right back there. And it was becoming, really a bit of a head fuck, because I thought, none of the stuff that I'm doing is working. And I started to doubt my skills as a practitioner. I started to doubt Chinese medicine, and I thought, what's going on? And so that I was feeling kind of helpless for a while. And then I remembered that I don't do helpless. I find answers. That's my shtick. And so I went and I did some studies in the area. I went online and researched a lot, and I uncovered that there was most likely a microbiome issue driving this recurrent UTI, and that it wasn't a case of, peeing after sex and wiping front to back, which is basically the only advice you'll get from a doctor. Drink water, pee after sex, wipe front to back. And I was like, I'm not 3, right? Like I know, I know how to use the bathroom by now. And so I think it was a Harvard medical study that I read talking about the role of Gardnerella, which is a vaginal microbe, in recurrent UTI. And then I was like, right, someone has to know about this. And then I found a mentor who teaches specifically about urogenital issues and the microbiome's involvement. And so I did her studies. I actually got her as a practitioner, and I got on top of it. And I thought, right, it must have been a microbiome issue. And it was fine for a few years. And then when we moved to Mexico, I got one. When we got here, I got really bad food poisoning, and I couldn't eat or drink for like a day or two. And then I got a UTI, and I was like, oh man, I haven't had one of those for years. And then it started to come back. It was becoming recurrent. And I was like, what the hell? I'm doing all the stuff that I know to do now that worked last time. Why isn't it working? And that's when I was like, God, back to the drawing board. So I was back researching and looking at the literature, and I discovered the role of oxalates and oxalate crystals forming in the body. And we'll undoubtedly talk about this during this episode. But yeah, so then I realized, okay, I have a problem with oxalate crystals. And to me, that seems to have been like the final piece of the puzzle, because I have been UTI free since. And that first time that I was like, right, I got the symptoms. I was like, right, this is not a UTI. This is my body dealing with probably like bladder stones, kidney stones. You've heard of those? Yeah. So I think I had bladder stones. So I was like, I can't take antibiotics. I just have to ride this out. And if I can ride it out, then I will know that I'm not dealing with a microbial issue. And so it was really scary, because in the past I had been really sick when I tried to let a UTI, tried to treat it naturally, but I was treating it in a different way. This time I treated it as though it was bladder stones and oxalate crystals. And yeah, I wound up actually past a stone. And that confirmed what I had been suspicious about. And so, yeah, that now I'm off down this whole new path of oxalates and dietary things that are good for me in my diet and healing my gut, and that's a topic for another day. But yeah, so that's the synopsis.
Yeah, wow. It's so frustrating how with these things it's often like some serious detective work and peeling back layers and unraveling things and following little rabbit holes and something working for a while but then not. Like, it's just I definitely have like fallen into the sort of hopelessness hole with things like this. Luckily I haven't had too much trouble with UTIs, but definitely back in the day with the thrush and the BV, I was just like ready to give up by the end. I'd tried so many different things and it's just so mything, I suppose. You know, it's very confusing sometimes, and it's hard to actually find solid support from practitioners that, you know, that do give you a little bit more in-depth advice than just drink water and, you know, have some cranberry juice and wipe front to back, you know. So, yeah, that was why I was keen to get you on, because I know that we're going to talk about it in a lot more depth than most people realize there even is to this subject, you know. So many people just go, all right, yep, just take antibiotics. And that's kind of the only, you know, it's the main treatment path that we are offered for this. And that holds its own drawbacks, because obviously if we're constantly taking antibiotics, we're just wrecking our gut microbiome and potentially creating, you know, antibiotic resistant bacteria and things like that. So I've always been very reluctant to take antibiotics unless I absolutely fucking have to. So I'm super pumped to talk to you about different ways that we can approach this and things that we can focus on rather than just that usual sort of pathway of like go to the doctor, get the antibiotics, rinse and repeat. Because it's just not always a very sustainable way to deal with this. And, you know, recurrent UTIs can be a whole other kettle of fish than like a standalone UTI episode that kind of, you know, is like a one event rather than this fucking basically a lifestyle that you have to get used to when you've got the constant recurrent UTI going on.
And I think, yeah, probably clarifying the difference between the two is important, that that a lot of people will get a UTI and it will be this sort of snapshot incident where it will have been one of the traditional triggers, too much sex, maybe not peeing after sex, maybe being out and being kind of sweaty and there's bacterial issues, and bam, we suddenly have E. coli causing a problem in the bladder. That's sort of how we've traditionally understood it. It's usually down to E. coli as the bacteria. I think the stats, I'm kind of guessing here, but I believe it's around 90% of UTIs are caused by, don't quote me on that, everybody feel free to go and check it, but it's a high proportion of cases are actually caused by E. coli. And in those cases, you can do, I've done the thing where I've started saying something and now 5 other thoughts have come into my head. This is what happens when you have a neurospicy brain. I was going to say you'll get a 7-day course of antibiotics, but then I'm like, well, you might or you might not, because he's actually on the medical side. He's passed away now. He didn't see any value in holistic approaches. He's 100% medical doctor guy. And he worked on Harley Street, the infamous Harley Street or famous Harley Street in the UK. I can't remember his name, but Professor Malone Lee. And his work is really fabulous, but it's very, very medicalized. But he believes that the issue with a lot of UTIs is that we get one instance and then it should be treated with 14 days of antibiotics. But for some reason, we've started, I think it's because we're concerned about antibiotic resistance and the impact of antibiotics on the gut microbiome. But nowadays, a standard course is 3 days of trimethoprim, and 3 days is not really very much. So he felt that what was happening was that 3 days is enough to calm the symptoms down, but it's not enough to eradicate the bacteria that are causing the problem. And so they kind of hang out and just wait for an opportunity. And then they take another opportunity and out they come, and you go back and you get 3 days of trimethoprim, or maybe they give you 5 days this time. And then you do 5 days, and then it goes away for a month. And then they've just been hanging around there waiting for the next opportunity, and out they come again. And because we don't see a family doctor often as well, people are just going to different doctors. And so then another doctor might be like, all right, 3 days of trimethoprim again. So, but in an acute UTI, you will go to the doctor, you will receive anywhere between 3 and 7 days of an antibiotic, and it could be trimethoprim or Augmentin, or some people are given Keflex, which does work, but I don't love Keflex because I don't think it's targeted enough. They'll usually send the urine away for culture to see if it's resistant to the type of antibiotic that's been prescribed. If it is, then they'll come in with a different antibiotic. And usually it's a 7-day course, the infection's dealt with, and then you move on with your life. And many women will have maybe 1 or 2, like their whole life, and you can treat it with antibiotics like that, and it's a successful way of doing it, and that's the end of it for them. But for a percentage of people, I was one, you just start going down this really slippery slope. So today I think we're going to be talking more about recurrent UTIs. And
yeah. Because those are the really sucky ones. Like I've had maybe 2 UTIs in my whole life, and that's it, luckily. But I do know when I was going through that whole sort of thrush BV cycle, and God knows whatever other dysbiosis was actually causing the symptoms over several years that I was kind of battling in this vicious cycle. It was just demoralizing and so disheartening, and you feel so hopeless and you feel so pitted against your body and frustrated, and it's horrible. It really lowers your quality of life. And I can imagine it's really similar with recurrent UTIs, potentially even more horrific because there's a lot more pain involved and potential for doing, like kidney and bladder damage if it anyway. So let's maybe get back to basics and just lay the foundation here, because as usual, we're getting ahead of ourselves. What actually happens in the body to create a UTI? Like give people a bit of a rundown, because that might help when we're going into more detail later.
So a standard, simple, uncomplicated UTI is where we get bacteria in the bladder that either shouldn't be there or is normally allowed to be there, but in quite low numbers. And the bacteria will proliferate, will grow its numbers, and then there's too many of them in there and it causes symptoms. And so that's basically, it's a very cagey answer, because you were like, let's have a basic answer. And I'm like, but there's other things I could talk about. But that's the traditional understanding is that particularly in a woman, because the anus is so close to the urethra, that you get translocation of bacteria from the anus, so gut bacteria, that makes its way into the urinary tract and ascends into either causes issues within the urethra or ascends into the bladder. And it's colonized by bacteria that shouldn't be there or that should be there in low numbers. And that causes symptoms, and then can, as you mentioned, if not treated, progress up the urinary system and into the kidneys, and that can be a potentially life-threatening situation.
Mm-mm.
What we're now finding, and this kind of plays into recurrent UTIs, is that in between the anus and the urethra, you have the vagina, which is this incredible it shouldn't be that diverse. It's an incredible space which should have a fairly low diversity of microbes. And if the microbes in the vagina go out, then you can get translation from the vagina to the urinary system, and that can be what's driving it. So it's actually got nothing to do with the gut or hygiene, wiping front to back. It's this relationship between the vaginal and urinary microbiomes. And we're learning about that all the time. We used to think that the bladder was kind of a sterile environment. Now we understand that we have a bladder microbiome and a vaginal microbiome, and those two will cross-talk and will cross-pollinate. And so that's another mechanism of how UTI
microbiome nowadays, right?
Microbiome.
Your brain supposedly got one they've just discovered.
And the brain and the gut talk. So there's that crosstalk, and you do have it's something called quorum sensing. So microbes can crosstalk; they can talk to different microbial colonies in different parts of the body. So we are on the tip of the iceberg about what we understand in terms of our microbiome. And I think I mentioned this in one of the old episodes, that to me it's just this beautiful, beautiful representation of how we live in a universe, and we are this teeny weeny little itty bitty drop of speck of dust in this vast universe, and we ourselves are a universe because we form the universe for all of our microbes. Most of your DNA is microbial DNA. They used to say that your microbes outnumbered the body's cells 10-1. I think that's been revised down. It's not quite 10-1, but there are more microbes than there are you in you.
Yeah, God. it's cool, but it's also like, geez, couldn't it just be a little bit more simple? Because when shit starts to go wrong, it is really hard to rein it back in and figure out what's going on.
Well, it is and it isn't, because I think at the end of the day, we do go back to basics regardless. Like, we don't necessarily have to understand all of the complexities of the microbiome if we understand how to bring the system into balance. And it's usually the same. I always say the boring stuff, but it's the simple stuff, which is diet, stress management, lifestyle, exercise, medications, these sorts of things. So you can get super duper duper complicated, and you can genome sequence, and you can, do PCR tests and all of that, or you can just be like, right, how do I set my system up? Because your system always wants to return to balance. But of course, it can definitely be helpful knowing what's gone out, and that's why there are certain tests you can run. Like, I don't tend to start with a microbiome mapping, a vaginal microbiome map, but in certain cases we're like, right, I want to see what kind of microbes we're dealing with, because the symptoms, I'll initially do a case and take down all the symptoms, and then formulate a picture and say, right, this is the direction I think we should go. But if that doesn't work, then we might do a microbiome panel, because there's something in there that I'm potentially missing. So it can be simple and it can be complicated. You're right.
Yeah. A really simple little tip that I remember learning, which I'm not fully sure if this is totally legit, but maybe you'll have some thoughts on this. And I guess it's probably more to tackle the one-off UTIs. But I remember learning that if you are making sure you get fully aroused before you have penetrative sex, and your erectile tissue, including your G-spot, aka the urethral sponge, is all puffed up with blood, then it actually squishes the urethra shut, and thereby prevents bacteria from the sex from traveling up the urethra, because of that cushioning and that sort of sealing shut of the urethra with the G-spot / urethral sponge tissue. Is that plausible to you?
100%. That makes perfect sense. And because my understanding is that the part of the reason that closes off, it's the same in a man's penis, right? Because we have all that, the same anatomy base, is that it's so that he can ejaculate without urine mixing with the ejaculate, correct? It closes off the valves. And so, yes, it would make sense that because women can ejaculate, and it would close off the urethral pathway so that you don't pee during ejaculation, and also would have the opposite effect of bacteria not being able to necessarily be pushed into that area. And I think this is an interesting point for us to be able to make, which is pee after sex is what you're always told to avoid UTIs. However, you need to give yourself a minute, because it's difficult to pee after sex for exactly the anatomical reason that you are saying. You need to give yourself a minute, take some deep breaths, don't force that pee, because that's going to be doing a number on your pelvic floor. But yes, if you find it difficult to pee immediately after sex, it's because you're trying to do it too soon. And you might have some tips on how to relax and get that area sort of back to
Well, I mean, my jam is usually trying to get the erectile tissue engorged in the first place, not trying to get rid of it. It's hilarious, because it's that classic thing of guys trying to pee with a boner.
Yeah,
we definitely get that
that's exactly it.
So I guess just think unsexy thoughts, guys. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I guess I don't want to get all too bogged down in I was going to kind of ask what are some of the other risks or dangers of having recurrent UTIs? Is that kind of constantly keeping your body in a state of inflammation or irritation or whatever. So feel free to touch on that if there's some relevant stuff. But I do want to make sure we have time to talk about the, I guess, treatment pathways and things that are, I guess, a little bit more geared towards giving people some hope and some action steps forward.
Yeah, the action items as opposed to the nerdy stuff. Yes, all of
still love the nerdy stuff.
Everything you just said is so stress, inflammation. These can all be drivers. Immune status can be drivers. So if you're constantly run down, your immune system is not going to be able to keep on top of infections the way it normally would.
Hey, baby babes. Sorry to interrupt. I just had to pop my head into the lounge here and mention another virtual lounge that I'd love you to get around. It's the Labia Lounge Facebook group that I've created for listeners of the potty to mingle in. There you'll find extra bits and bobs like freebies, behind the scenes, or discounts for offerings from guests who have been interviewed on the podcast. There'll also be, hopefully, inspiring, thought-provoking conversations and support from a community of labial legends like yourself. My vision for this is that it becomes a really supportive, educational and hilarious resource for you to have more access to me and a safe space to ask questions you can't ask anywhere else. So head over to the links in the show notes or look up the Labia Lounge group in Facebook and I'll see you in there. And now, back to the episode.
Being diabetic can increase your risk and stage of life with women as well. So you can be more prone to them when you're very little and when you're past menopause, because the vaginal microbiome profile of a prepubescent girl is very, very similar to that of a postmenopausal woman because of the role of estrogen on the vaginal microbiome. So, so diet plays a role, of course, because if you want to maintain a healthy gut, because you get that translocation happening from the different areas, so from anus to urethra. So diet plays a role, as does sugar so sugar feeds into diet, but sugar feeds bacteria and not the helpful ones. So making sure that your diet is dialed in, and stress also seems to play a role, because a lot of people will find they get flares during stress, and stress drives inflammation, as we know. So yeah, there are different things that can happen. And once you get inflammation, you can be kind of on this like hamster wheel. So yeah, depending on what's driving it, that will dictate the other things that are going to exacerbate the problem.
Yeah. And I heard that like if you are on that sort of hamster wheel of chronic recurrent UTIs, there can be things that go along with that. And I don't know, it's a bit of a chicken or an egg thing. I didn't look too deeply into it because I was like, I'm just going to ask Joanna. But, you can also get things like insomnia, chronic fatigue, anxiety, depression. If you have been getting recurrent UTIs for a long period of time, some of those things can also start to affect you as a result. Is that correct? Or are they also all kind of like just interwoven and it's hard to tell which comes first?
Yeah, you actually make a good point that are people who are more prone to anxiety likely to develop anxiety if they get chronic UTIs? I would say yes, but it is very anxiety provoking. And it's, like you said, it's a real downer because you start to fear things. I mean, for me, it was like coffee, wine, and sex. My three great loves. And all of those things filled me with dread for quite a while. And it can have an impact on your relationship, because most of us have wonderfully loving and kind partners who don't want to pressure us into sex because they know it's a trigger point. And so they might not initiate, or they might initiate and you've knocked them back 3 times already because you were feeling a bit bladdery. And then so you're like, oh, I better do it. And then you get an infection, and then that can build resentment. And it can just be complicated. And equally, you can feel incredible guilt, because you're not able to be as available to your partner as you might want. And if you do make yourself available sexually to your partner, then you could be in for a world of hurt. So it's a no-win situation, and it can be really, really stressful and anxiety provoking. And the other thing is stuff like going on holiday. I've had a UTI. I was talking to a young client the other day she's a UTI client, and she's off on a trip, a 6-week trip. And we're kind of putting together a little plan of action, a little UTI prevention kit sort of situation. And I said to her, look, if the worst case scenario happens, you'll find people to help. I've had UTIs I started to list off all the countries that I've wound up in the emergency room with UTIs. Japan, twice. Italy, where else? Mexico, where else? There was one other place. I think I've had UTIs all over the world. And people have always helped me, when I needed it. I had friends of mine when I was in Japan that got really bad. I actually had full-on cystitis. I was peeing blood. My friends carried me to the emergency room, and a girlfriend who spoke better Japanese than I did the whole consult with me because I just was in too much pain and didn't actually have the language skills. And so, yeah, it's I've gone off on a massive tangent there, but it's really stressful because you don't want to go on holidays because you think, what if I get a UTI in Greece? It can affect work if you're at a workplace and you're constantly up and down to the bathroom, or you have to take a lot of time off because it's debilitating. It's not, if you're having to pee every hour, you can't work like that. So it definitely can feed into anxiety, depression, and it can affect other systems as well. You can, as you were saying, go to the kidney and multifaceted.
Oh, yeah, such a bummer. I remember just being like terrified to even go camping, let alone go overseas. And I'd always have a thrush tablet, tucked away in my first aid kit just in case I got caught out, because I did get caught out in places where I couldn't access a pharmacy. And it was just like, oh my God.
And it always strikes at like midnight on a Sunday or a Saturday or a Sunday. It's never 4:00 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. It's always the worst possible time. So, so you're absolutely right.
So I didn't realize there were UTI vaccines, but in my little cursory internet check before I jumped on this call, I was like, oh, there's like a bunch of these UTI vaccines. I have no idea. I mean, I'm like just naturally quite suspicious. But what are your thoughts on UTI vaccines?
So, I mean, I'm open to everything because it is a really complicated issue. And there are... Again, we've had a beautiful meandering conversation, so we'll just pull us back to what can you do about a UTI. So there is antibiotics that you can use. There are long-term antibiotics that you can use. So if you've gone and had 3, 4, 5, 6, a year's worth of antibiotics and nothing's happening, what they will then put you on is a long-term course or antibiotics as a prophylactic. So some women, every time they have sex, because that's their main trigger, they will take an antibiotic afterwards in order to prevent a UTI, and they will do that for the rest of their life. It's usually Bactrim. I know. And for me, I am open to anything that helps the individual because, as we were just talking about, it's a living hell. So I'm not going to rule anything out for someone. But if someone came to me and said, oh, yes.
A living hell because it would wreck their gut? Like, wouldn't that just create other problems?
So it depends on the antibiotic. Yes is the short answer to that question. But actually, some of the antibiotics that we use for UTIs don't actually impact the colonic bacteria that much because they concentrate in the bladder. That's why they're specific for UTIs, because they concentrate in the bladder. That's where they have their main mechanism of action. So macrodantin's a common one. It doesn't really have a detrimental impact on the colonic bacteria. But do you want to be taking antibiotics every time you have sex? Probably not. Like, no one wants to be on a long-term medication. So those people for whom sex is their primary trigger and they're taking antibiotics after sex, I would say I think we need to be educating primary care practitioners a little more about the role of the microbiome. I think it's starting, but because I believe that a significant proportion of those people, those women, are going to be better off if they have a look at the microbiome and the role that it's playing. So many of them probably could wean off that antibiotic, or maybe don't have to take it every single time if they had some other interventions. So you can have long-term antibiotics where some people will take a lower dose. I think it starts at a normal dose and then they titrate down over time, and you can do that for, I think it's a year is the current time frame, and that has certainly worked for a lot of women as well, because they're actually eradicating that bacteria. Because what happens is every time you take antibiotics, this is how antibiotic resistance works, is the bacteria are not these dumb things that just float around by themselves. And again, we talked about this in that episode that's a couple of years old, but it's still a cracker, so go back and listen to it. But they actually hang out in colonies and groups, and they're aware when they're under attack. And they will, I used this example in the last podcast, like in Vikings when they go shield wall and they all cluster together and put their shields up and the arrows bounce off them. That's what microbes do. They get together in a group and they secrete a biofilm, which is this kind of like sludgy material that protects them from antibiotic attack. And then they can just hang out there for the whole 10 days of your course of antibiotics. And then you go off antibiotics, and then they sense that the threat has gone, and they will start to mobilize maybe because there's trauma to the area, or your immune system is run down, as we were talking about before. And so they will mobilize back out into circulation, bringing with them their symptoms. And then you hit them with antibiotics again, and they are already a little bit resistant to that antibiotic because they saw it last time. And so over time, they become less and less resistant to it, and they just hang out. And that's, we have these biofilms that form in the bladder, in the vagina, and breaking down that biofilm actually forms a part of treatment. So antibiotics, that's basically short-term, prophylactically, or long-term antibiotics. What was the question again?
What are some other treatment plans, I suppose? And yeah, I'd love to know how to break down biofilms, because those cunts are the worst. Like that was, I did a lot of research into that when I was trying to kick the thrush stuff, and I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, N-acetylcysteine is my favorite biofilm buster, but there are other ones. But NAC, the supplement, is very good at breaking down biofilms. So then we need to figure out if antibiotics hasn't worked, or someone doesn't want to be on long-term or prophylactic antibiotics, or they would like to be able to stop antibiotics at some point in the future, we need to then look at the person and say, okay, why are you dealing with these recurrent UTIs? What is driving it for you? Maybe we look at figuring out if there's any dysbiosis in the vaginal microbiome, and that will be pretty evident because they might have had an STD in the past, or it's an STI now, isn't it? They might have had an STI in the past. They may have had recurrent UTIs, recurrent thrush or bacterial vaginosis. That suggests that there's already some dysbiosis in the vaginal environment. So then you can work on stabilizing that environment, and that's done again through stress management, diet, herbs, and probiotics play a really important role there as well. So in the vagina, there's sort of 4 or 5 main microbes that you want, and then lower levels of lots of other ones. So you want to make sure that you're supporting the 4, I think it's 4 or 5, the 4 or 5 main ones. They're there. They kind of act like crowd control. They're the bouncers. They make sure that not too many rowdy people come in. Like no one with singlets and flip-flops are allowed in. And so you want to support the growth of those guys and make the environment inhospitable to the gate crasher types that are coming in and causing problems. And you do that by adjusting the pH of the vagina. The vagina is meant to be quite acidic. So if you've got an alkaline shift in the vagina, then you can address that. You can correct that, and that can help stabilize that environment. So looking at the role of the vaginal microbiome, and then just general health, sleep, stress management, exercise, gut health. Those ones, they're the main ones. So the time that I did get, the last time I had a UTI, I think it was, only the second one I've ever had. I really didn't want to take antibiotics because I'd had so many gut issues and I'd spent years trying to get my microbiome right. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not just going to wipe out all my good work, because of this UTI. There's got to be a way that I can head it off before it really takes root. Little did I know, it had already obviously taken root, and that's when I started experiencing symptoms. And I was really shocked by the speed with which it just got really out of control. And I remember being like, no, I don't want to, I'm just going to take, I don't know, I think my housemate at the time had some Ural or some, cranberry powder, but I was sort of just trying to do all these natural things. And it moved to my kidney. I just got woken up at 3 a.m. The second day that I had symptoms, and I was getting these stabbing pains in my kidney, and I was like, oh my God, because people had said, oh, you got to look out because once it gets there, it's going to really create a lot of damage and it's really bad and you have to go to hospital. And so I, immediately went to the doctor and took the antibiotics. Is there something we can do that isn't antibiotics when we start noticing symptoms, or is it more like a preventative thing when it comes to the natural pathways? Yes and no is the answer to that question. So yes, theoretically there is. If it's being driven, I think we were going to talk about D-mannose, so now's a good time. If it's being driven by E. coli, then D-mannose is a supplement. It's a sugar, and it has the ability to bind to the mannan receptor on the E. coli bacteria. So receptors are like little locks that keys go into to, communicate with the cell. And D-mannose can lock onto that mannan receptor and bind up the E. coli. And then it concentrates in the bladder and you pee it out. So the D-mannose runs around, basically gives big bear hugs to the E. coli and then pulls it out of the body via the bladder. So theoretically, if you take D-mannose in high enough doses early enough in the path of the infection, you can actually treat a UTI with D-mannose. So I think it's far better as a preventative, of course, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say. There are some herbs like uva ursi is a common one. We have some Chinese medicine herbal formulas that we use, and I've used one of those successfully with my daughter. She had one, was after I had all the dramas with one, and she got one. And I remember, it's quite funny when you are a practitioner and you have a child, you always panic. You're like, I know what I'm supposed to do, but it's my child and So I just took her straight to the doctor, and of course they gave her an antibiotic, and she did a week's worth of antibiotics, and then it came back, and it was in the middle of lockdown during Melbourne. And by that time I was like, get a grip of yourself, Joanna. You know how to deal with this. So I put her on D-mannose and a herbal formula, the Chinamed Euroclear blend, and I put her on that for 10 days and she was fine. She's never had a problem since. So yes, it's possible. However, massive caveat, as you know, it very quickly can ascend to the kidneys. So you don't want to muck around. And I often say to people, go to the doctor, do a dipstick test, although we're sort of starting to see that maybe they're not as accurate as they could be. They're quite often contaminated, like maybe 50% of the time they're inaccurate, but it's another tool that we use within the toolkit. But go to the doctor. They will probably give you a script for antibiotics, and then you at least have that script, and you can go to a 24-hour chemist at any point and fill that script. So, but as you know, it can turn pretty quickly and it can be serious. So it's always best to involve a doctor as well as a holistic practitioner as well. And I would say in acute situations, I still support going to the doctor and at least having the option of antibiotics on hand.
Yeah. Nice to have in case of emergencies. So with the D-mannose, I kind of saw it's like a randomized clinical trial recently that found that it didn't have any kind of positive correlate, like it didn't actually help. And they were like, oh, what the hell? Because so many women do report it being really helpful for them. Is that because it depends what the cause of their particular recurrent UTIs are? Like maybe in the trial there was some that was due to E. coli and some that was due to other things. And so there wasn't any kind of significant, improvement with the D-mannose in that trial. But then in like real life, some people will have a lot of success with it and some people won't because of the cause of their specific UTI. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think we have to stop putting double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trials on a fucking pedestal, we have to listen to people's lived experience. I'm always going to listen to the person in front of me. I don't care what the science says. I think it's important to know the science. I don't think we should discredit the fact that trials are important, testing is important, particularly for drugs and stuff. But at the end of the day, we have to listen to the person in front of us. And so it could be a number of things that went wrong with that trial. Definitely, if the UTI was being driven by anything other than E. coli, it wouldn't have been successful. Maybe they weren't using it in quantities that are large enough. So if they're only taking like 500 milligrams a day, for example, it might not have been enough. As I said before, I think it's better as a prevention, and nothing works in isolation, really. You need to change other things. So a lot of the time when someone starts taking D-mannose, they might also throw in a probiotic because they read that probiotics are good, and maybe they cut sugar out of their diet as well. And so it's that cumulative impact of making several positive changes as well as D-mannose that has the effect. Whereas in a clinical trial, you are removing those variables. You don't want anything that's confounding the results. So I think D-mannose is a tool that forms part of a management strategy, but 100% it is very effective when used for E. coli driven issues in conjunction with other interventions.
Cool.
In my clinical experience.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, I really like what you said about, not pedestalizing those sorts of trials over the lived human experience and that anecdotal, it's so infuriating how dismissive, Western medicine and so many people are around anecdotal evidence that's kind of like straight from the horse's mouth, So yeah, I like that you mentioned that. Speaking of studies, one just popped into my head I saw around wiping direction, which I thought was a really funny thing that they've like studied. And, it's just the one study, so you can never really take it as gospel. But they found that the front to back versus back to front didn't have any significant impact on lifetime UTI events, but the age bracket 40 to 59, there was the wiping front to back did significantly wiping back to front significantly increased UTIs. So I was like, oh, that's weird. Like, I wonder why that age bracket. Is it because they're more susceptible, or the UTIs they're getting are more due to the transfer of bacteria, from the anus to the vagina and then up into I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say, just, theorizing that, it's because you get a change to the vaginal microbiome at that stage of life, and you also get a change to the gut microbiome. So a lot of perimenopausal women suffer gut issues once they get into their 40s. Suddenly they're intolerant to foods that they've been eating their entire life. And I was actually really reading a very funny thread today in one of the perimenopause support groups that I'm a member of on Facebook, because I cruise around and answer questions. And one woman was like, why am I farting so much? What is with the farting? And all these women are like, oh my God, my husband thinks it's hilarious. I'm so embarrassed, but I just fart all the time. And it's because you get a change to the gut microbiome as well. Food intolerances are more likely because at that stage of life, your immune system is going through a restructure. It's second puberty, and go back and listen to that episode that we did if you haven't. So you can get functional dyspepsia, which is basically just anytime you eat, you get full, you get a bit kind of nauseous, bloated, gassy. You only eat a small amount and suddenly you feel really distended. So it would make sense that the changing microbial landscapes within both the gut and vaginal microbiomes in that age group would lead to an increase in urinary symptoms with back to front wiping.
Nice. Makes so much sense. Cool. So let's talk about differential diagnosis and the importance of this, because we've sort of touched on like, hey, it's not as simple, as one might think. There's actually multiple different types of, different causes that might be driving, each individual's UTI experience. Let's chat about like what differential diagnosis looks like and why that is so important, and how you might be able to go about finding a practitioner who will do a good job of that.
Excuse this quick interruption. I'm shamelessly seeking reviews and 5-star ratings for the potty because, as I'm sure you've noticed by now, it's pretty fab, and the more people who get to hear it, the more people I can help with it. Reviews and ratings actually do make a big difference to this little independent podcaster, and it's really easy to just quickly show your support by taking that simple act of either leaving 5 stars for the show on Spotify, or even better, writing a written review and leaving 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts. Or if you're a real overachiever, you can do them both. That would be mad. If you're writing a review, though, just be sure to use G-rated words, because despite the fact that this is a podcast about sexuality, words like sex can be censored and your review won't make it through the gates. Lame. Anyway, I would personally recommend doing that right now while you remember, just to get on top of it and let me know you're with me on this journey. Thanks, gang. Enjoy the rest of the epi.
Yeah, so I'll say one more thing about drivers of UTIs that's just popped into my head, which is sometimes we need to treat the partner as well, because the penis has its own microbiome. And what you can actually find is that there's an incompatibility between what usually happens is you meet someone, you start having a sexual relationship with them, if it's long-term and unprotected sex over time, then those two microbial environments, the penile environment and vaginal environment, will homogenize. So they'll get used to each other. You'll share microbes and you fall into balance with each other. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And so it may be that the microbiomes don't quite mesh, or it may be that the penile microbiome is harboring a microbe that is disrupting the vaginal microbiome, and we need to treat that specific microbe for that individual. And sometimes it can also be something in the semen. There can be a bacterial, because we have a seminal microbiome as well. So you're talking about microbiome palooza. So that's another thing that can potentially be driving it. And then in terms of just, is it actually a recurrent UTI is a really good question. Or what, maybe it was a recurrent UTI, but now you're getting urinary symptoms that are not a full-blown state of UTI, active UTI. And that's anything from interstitial cystitis, which is kind of, I'm being a bit harsh, but it's sort of what they diagnose people with when they don't have an actual diagnosis. It's an umbrella term for a collection of symptoms. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's not really a one thing. It basically means that this person suffers irritation. So it could be interstitial cystitis, and that could be driven from tissue inflammation. It could be driven from oxalate crystals causing inflammation. It could be a nerve condition. So the nerves of the bladder are not communicating properly with the brain, and you're constantly feeling irritated and like you need to pee. So we need to dig into, whenever anyone says they have interstitial cystitis, I like to dig into why that might be for that individual. There's the oxalate issue, which was my personal case, where I was eating a lot of foods that are actually healthy, but they contain a large quantity of something called oxalic acid. And oxalic acid binds to calcium in the body and causes a crystalline structure that under a microscope looks like shards of crushed fiberglass. So if you are not, we can't metabolize these. We don't break them down. We just excrete them. There is oxalobacter, which is a microbe in the gut, which I think can work on breaking them down a little bit, but mainly it's an excretion pathway. And if you're not excreting them well, because genetically you're not good at it, or if, like me, you were just overeating healthy food, things like spinach, peanut butter, almonds, black beans, sweet potato, white potato, these are all pretty common foods that we consider to be pretty healthy. Figs, I lived in it when I had the 7-year kind of commencement of the UTIs. There was a fig tree in my backyard in the house that I was living in, and I used to stuff myself with figs because I love them, but they're incredibly high oxalate. So I was like over consuming all of these foods, and we don't eat seasonally really anymore. So spinach you can usually only get for a couple of months a year, and then you would have winter where you didn't have access to these kind of high oxalate greens, and your body has a chance to detox them. But now you go to the supermarket, spinach is there 12 months of the year. And because people say, oh, spinach is healthy, you've got people, it happened to Thor, what's his name? The hot Aussie guy, Hemsworth. Chris Hemsworth, he got a kidney stone because he was having smoothies in the morning, and he was putting like 5 handfuls of spinach with almond milk, because almonds is healthy, and peanut butter, and so he wound up actually in hospital with a kidney stone. So you can have too much of a good thing. And so if you have a problem with oxalate crystals, they can lodge in the bladder and they can cause irritation and issues, that constant feeling like you've got fiberglass in your bladder lining. But they also can create a structure that E. coli bacteria hang out in. So they create like a reservoir for E. coli. Yeah. And so exactly. So that's why you can be having this constant low-level irritation, and you think, oh, gosh, if I got a UTI, you go to do a dipstick, you give a urine sample, and there is high concentration of E. coli, because the E. coli has been making a home in the reservoir of oxalate crystals in the bladder. And so if oxalates are playing a role, then you just remove them from the diet, but you have to do it slowly. I actually have a photo on my Instagram because I went too quick. Once you discover it, you're like, oh, I'm not eating these poisonous things anymore. Even though I knew through my research that you have to step down slowly, Because what happens is the body starts stashing it in the tissues. It knows it's a toxin. It knows it's not good. So it just shoves it anywhere it can. And when your blood level of oxalate drops to a certain point, the body goes, oh, thank God I can get rid of all this shit that I've been stashing. And it dumps it out into the bloodstream. You can actually die if you have –
What?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's crazy. Toxic Superfoods is the book to read by Sally K. Norton, if anybody's interested in this topic or sees themselves kind of in the picture. And so you have to calculate how much oxalate you are consuming, and then you have to titrate down. And I didn't want to do the maths because I don't like maths. So I just kind of ballparked what I must have been eating. And I was like, oh, just cut out all this, but I'll keep in dark chocolate. That's another one. Tea, English breakfast tea, really high oxalate. So like, I'll just keep in tea and chocolate. But I obviously was eating more oxalate than I realized. And it started to come out through my skin. And I got what looked to be a breakout initially, and that's the picture that's on Instagram. I thought I'd broken out in hives, but it got so bad I had to use like cortisone cream on my face. It was because the crystals were forcing their way out of my face. It was full on. It was intense. So oxalates can be another driver, and then
how long did that detox process take? Like you're out the other side, obviously now.
I'm about a year on from it now. And
I guess it would depend on the person and how much they've got to detox.
Yeah, there's a Trying Low Oxalates, TLO, is a support group on Facebook, and I became a member of that group when I sort of thought this was an issue for me. And there are some people who've been detoxing from oxalates for 10 years and they're still getting flares. And yeah.
Oh, so some people must be more sensitive to them, right? Because I don't know, I feel like I eat a fair bit of oxalate-y stuff and I've never had an issue with this. So is it something everyone needs to be really careful of, or it's going to affect some people more than others?
This is such a great question, and I'd love to come back for a fifth time and talk about how to choose the right diet, because there's so much stuff online. And without going off down the rabbit hole, because I am conscious of time on this one, I promised myself I'd try and stay focused. When I discovered I couldn't eat, and it comes from oxalic crystals oxalic acid is in plant food. It's not in meat and animal products. So when I found out that I couldn't eat these plant products anymore, I was like, well, I'm going to give carnivore a go, because look at all these carnivore people. They're all ripped. They've got great skin, and I believe that the argument is there when you look into the literature that it's a species appropriate diet for us. So I did it for a year and it has not agreed with me. And there'll be people who'll be like, oh, you haven't done it properly. You're meant to test your ketones or whatever. But I just think we cannot be dogmatic about diet. Just because you have a problem with something doesn't mean someone else will have a problem with it. Just because something helped you doesn't mean it will help another person. So absolutely. I think we should all know what oxalates are. I think we should all know what foods they are in. And I think we should all be a little just careful and moderate in how we consume those foods. The easiest way, because it's in plant foods, is eat seasonally. I think if we were all eating what was available seasonally, we wouldn't have the issues. But you're 100% right that some people are more sensitive to them. I have a couple of people in clinic who I was working with who were hardcore vegans for like 10 years. So they have super high levels of oxalate in the body just because of the types of food that they were eating. But if you've been an omnivore your whole life, then it's likely that you have consumed less of them. So, yeah, it's a little bit variable.
And the only times I got UTIs, two times I got UTIs were when I was a vegan. So, just another little bit of anecdotal evidence.
That's really super interesting. And so maybe you did have some level of, I'm just totally hypothesizing, but you might have a little reservoir in the bladder and that was causing a little bit of irritation. But if it went away with antibiotics, and that's the thing, like I believe was it when you had the vaginal dysbiosis stuff going on?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, so it's probably more likely linked to that, because if the antibiotics did work, then it was probably more of a marker. But who knows? That's what I'm saying. It's a complicated area, and that's why if someone has been helped by a year of antibiotics, then I just say, ring that bell, more power to you. You know, we have to be open to what works, because depending on the microbe that's causing it for the individual, if it's microbially driven, you're going to have varying levels of success with natural interventions. Antibiotics may be the best course of action for that individual, but working up an appropriate diagnosis, I think that's key. And so just to kind of close out what we were talking about in terms of differential diagnosis, endometriosis can actually have, right before the period, you can get a flare of bladder symptoms, particularly if you've got what they call bladder endos, with the bladders involved with the lesions. That can be a tricky one, because the only way you can diagnose endo is on laparoscopic surgery. You have to go in and look. There is currently no test for endometriosis. I think they're working on a salivary test, and that will be revolutionary if they can, because the current timeframe to diagnosis for endo is between 7 to 10 years, I think. And a lot of people kind of trash talk doctors around that. They're like, this is not good enough. You know, we need better outcomes for women. And we 100% do. I agree with that. But, and any doctor that says, you know, if a woman comes in with painful periods and painful sex, that says, just have a glass of wine and lighten up, and do you have any problems in your relationship? I mean, that's unacceptable, right? But if you suspect endometriosis, the only way to confirm that diagnosis is a laparoscopic surgery. And then you need to make sure that you get a surgeon that knows what they're doing, because endo lesions can look different. You can have flat white lesions. You can have quite red, angry looking lesions. They do present differently. So you need an advanced trained surgeon who knows what they're looking for, because it can be subtle.
Yeah. Okay, amazing. So are there any other kind of different causes for UTIs that the differential diagnosis would be looking to try to discover?
I think they were the main ones I just went through, wasn't it? So I said oxalates, endo. What was the other one? Of course, you've asked me directly and I've blanked out.
E. coli? Well, that's kind of
no, interstitial cystitis. I think they're the main ones. There may be some that I've missed, because my brain's getting weary now after an hour of talking, but I guess the major takeaway is that is it actually a UTI?
Yeah, okay. And so how would you suggest getting that diagnosis, like when a lot of maybe doctors aren't super across this, like going to someone like you or more specialist vibes?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's necessary to find someone who specializes in this area. And now that may be a gynecologist who specializes in the area. Even so, they may, if it's being driven by a microbe like BV, Gardnerella, for example, they will prescribe metronidazole, which is an antibiotic. And then that's what they fail to do. And I believe that we covered this in that vaginal microbiome episode. But what they failed to do post antibiotic treatment is rebuild the environment. So it's like if you have people robbing a bank robbers, and they've got hostages inside the bank, there are different ways that you can deal with that situation. You can send in a SWAT team and a hostage negotiator. You can try and negotiate with the bank robbers. You can try and get hostages. Okay, give us the children and the women, get them out. You know, there's ways that you can diffuse that situation delicately. Or you could drop a bomb on the bank, right? Solves the problem. There's no more bank robbers. But you've annihilated the bank and you've killed all the bystanders. That is what happens when you use antibiotics. You bomb the bank. And then you just kind of hope that it rebuilds itself in a balanced and healthful state. And we don't really have any reason to believe that it's going to magically do that, because it was disordered when we started. So what we need to do after using antibiotics is then go on a restoration protocol and say, okay, how do we encourage this environment that we just wiped out because we had to get rid of some bad guys? How do we rebuild this neighborhood and encourage the right kind of people that we want to come and live in it, microbes that we want to come and live in it? We want good neighbors. And in the gut, you want diversity. You want we need like a Jewish family, and we need, like the Asian family to come and have the takeaway shop. And you want lots of multiculturalism, lots of diversity in the gut. In the vagina, it's a little bit more closed community. It's a little bit of what do they call
gated
it?
Community.
Gated community. Yeah, it's a little bit more of a gated community. It's a fraccionamiento here in Mexico, because you need a lower level of diversity in that vaginal microbiome. But you need to help it restructure in a healthful way. And that's the missing link. So I'd say even if you do go to a gynecologist or someone that is very medically driven, ask them if they can help you with a restoration protocol. And that should involve some form of probiotic, prebiotic therapy, and some strategies and tactics for lifestyle modification while that environment is rebuilding. So, for example, we don't want to be having unprotected sex because semen is incredibly alkaline, and we want the environment of the vagina to be acidic while it's rebuilding. So you might need to use condoms for a while. The oral microbiome can be quite challenging to the vaginal microbiome. So maybe abstaining from oral sex while it's rebuilding. So yeah, it is a niche area, and there are people from all different kind of backgrounds, nutritionists, dietitians, naturopathy and Chinese medicine. So they're sort of the areas that you might want to look in if you're looking for someone to help you out.
Beautiful. Yeah, and those are really practical tips, I think, as well, around the probiotics and the lifestyle factors, the dietary factors, not getting jizz inside you, being a little bit more sparing with the oral. Because when I wasn't with UTIs, but when I was struggling with the thrush and the vaginal dysbiosis, definitely receiving oral or having sex with unprotected sex or sex with a new person, just a different person's bacteria, it always used to send me off the deep end. So I just had to become a very good gatekeeper for my poussoir. And just be super careful about what was coming into contact with it, because it was just literally the balance was so delicate and so easily tipped off balance. So, that's
how long did it take you to stabilize? I know everybody's different, but I'm just really curious about how long it took you to.
Well, I can't even really remember now, and it's tricky to know when the sort of healing properly started, because there would be periods of time where I thought I was on top of it for a while and then it would kind of come back. But I was sort of really intensively working on it for at least 2 or 3 years. With all different gut protocols and cut out sugar and fruit and alcohol and mushrooms and all the things for a year. And I was on super, super restrictive diets at different points and going to naturopaths and nutritionists and doing all the things. And it's funny because nothing really ever seemed to help. And then just when I stopped being a vegan and I stopped basically being orthorexic because I'd become obsessed with health and biohacking and trying to do all the right things, and now everything was bad for me. When I was like, fuck it, none of this is making me healthier, I'm feeling sicker and sicker, everything started to just kind of balance out again. And I don't know if it was, it could have been the vegan thing, it could have been the stress, it could have just been, my relationship with food becoming so tenuous because of worrying about gut health and stuff. But yeah, when I sort of stopped caring and I was like, fuck it, whatever. Also, I was, I think, definitely being impacted by toxic mold. So when I moved house and, started detoxing that. So there was so many things, and I still couldn't tell you which ones were the most kind of crucial to my healing, because I was doing a lot all at once and making a lot of changes. So yeah, I'm not really sure what was responsible for.
Well, I think you're also an onion. We are a couple of onions together, because it would have been multi-layered, and mold definitely is a massive immune system trigger. And I'm going to go on record here and say that I don't think most people do well on a vegan diet long term. I really don't. I think that it can be done, but the majority of people do better with animal products in their diet. So it might have had something to do with that, but it definitely sounds like it was probably a multi-layered thing.
Yeah, totally.
But I guess the upshot of that, the key takeaway of that, is healing takes time. And so if anyone listening to this is dealing with any kind of chronic or long-term condition, understand that it can and will get better. People have healed from similar things and the same thing that you're going through, but you may need to be patient.
And, a kind of little bit more of a woo-woo side note, I was, trying to do the whole open relationship poly thing throughout that period of time, and I was sleeping with multiple different people over periods of time. So when I stopped doing that and then ended up in a long-term relationship, that also kind of coincided with me not having the recurrent thrush issues as well. So I think, on an energetic and spiritual and emotional level, that lifestyle I was really struggling with that. And then also just the sheer amount of new and different bacteria I was letting into my vagina, would have been throwing me off. So
yeah, poppy's not for the faint of heart. Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I mean, having a hoe phase is fun, but I don't think it's great for the old vagina. That's for sure.
No, I would have to agree with that. And I'm very libertarian. Like, I believe live and let live, let people do what makes them happy, as long as they're not hurting or harming another individual. But I would definitely say that I think physiologically we are more designed to be monogamous than polyamorous. But I think too, something you said, which is how I'll close out my portion of today, is I don't know if people know the story of Buddha. Like, he was a prince and he lived in all of this opulent, luxurious life, and he wasn't happy or satisfied. And so he left the palace and went searching for enlightenment, and he decided that he'd been, living a far too opulent lifestyle, and that the answer must lie in poverty and simplicity. And so he starved himself down until he was emaciated and he wore rags, and then he decided, shit, this isn't any better. And so he sat under the tree and had his moment of enlightenment, because he realized that it's the middle path, the middle way is the way to enlightenment. And if you look at yin and yang as well, Chinese medicine, it's never about being super duper yang or super duper yin. It's about the balance and interplay between those two opposing forces. And generally speaking, for health anywhere in life, and I'm prone to it too, because I'm a big nerd, and so I get excited about concepts like going carnivore, for example. And it just reminds me nicely, this discussion, that the middle path for everybody, in your thought, in your speech, in the way you show up in the world, in your actions, everything, that we need to strike for that balance between the extremes.
Yeah. Word. Totally agree with that. Do you have a TMI story you want to leave us on though? We're not even going to bother doing Get Pregnant and Die. We've done so many episodes together now. But do you have a fresh TMI?
TMI, we love it. Said TMI, we love it.
What? I forgot about your special TMI.
I nearly forgot about them as well.
Oh, man, now I feel bad, because actually nothing is jumping out. Although, I suppose I can share one that would be relevant to women listeners, which is because this carnivore diet has thrown off my hormones. My hormones are whack at the moment. And I've had some anovulatory cycles, which I haven't had for many, many, many years now, which is basically, if you don't ovulate during the month, your lining just continues to build until such time as your body's like, well, might as well get rid of it. And then you'll get, air quotes, your period, but it's not your period. You only get a period if you have ovulated. That kind of bleed is what they call an ovulatory bleed, an anovulatory cycle. And it's generally a lot heavier than an ovulatory cycle, because progesterone, which you only get if you ovulate, helps to lighten the period. It stops that. It opposes estrogen, and estrogen builds the lining. So if you have no progesterone, estrogen's just there happily making uterine lining. And so for the first time since I was a teenager, I bled through period products at the freaking supermarket. And I was with my husband, and I was like, we have to go. And he was like, what? And I was like, I've just bled through a tampon. And I had to do that little waddly shuffle thing.
Yeah. Oh my God.
So fortunately we only live 5 minutes away from the shops. And so now I'm tracking my cycle. And if I haven't ovulated, when I get my period, I make sure that I double protect on the way out of the house. Tampon and pad. I'm back to acting like a 15-year-old.
Totally. Oh my God, bless. Yeah, I remember those days. My period was so heavy when I was a teenager compared to now. Is that because when we first start getting a bleed, often they are anovulatory cycles when we're first,
can be anovulatory, but also, the body's learning the steps of a dance. So if you think about when you're learning, people who play musical instruments, when you're learning something, it's kind of clunky at first. It doesn't flow smoothly. You your body needs a moment to figure out what it's doing. It's a complicated cascade of hormonal production that involves multiple systems in the body, the brain, the gonads, thyroid, all these different things are involved. And so it's learning the steps of a dance. And that's similarly why perimenopause, suddenly things go all wacky, because the body's learning a new dance, a new way of being. And so it is a second puberty. You get all very similar symptoms to the ones that you might have experienced in puberty. And again, just because everybody's different, some people have an easy puberty but a shitty perimenopause, and vice versa. So there's different flavors of it. But yes, a lot of the time with young girls, it's just the body figuring out which quantities of hormone to produce at which time.
Yeah, gotcha. Hey, me again. If you'd like to support the potty and you've already given it 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening on, I want to mention that you can buy some really dope merch from the website and get yourself a Labia Lounge tote, tee, togs. Yep, you heard that right. I even have Labia Lounge bathers. Or a cute fanny pack if that'd blow your hair back. So if fashion isn't your passion, though, you can donate to my Buy Me a Coffee donation page, which is actually called Buy Me a Soy Chai Latte, because I'll be the first to admit I'm a bit of a Melbourne cafe tosser like that. And yes, that is my coffee order. You can do a once-off donation or an ongoing membership and sponsor me for as little as 3 fat ones a month. And I also offer one-on-one coaching and online courses that'll help you level up your sex life and relationship with yourself and others in a really big way. So every bit helps, because it ain't cheap to put out a sweet podcast into the world every week out of my own pocket. So I will be undyingly grateful if you support me and my biz financially in any of these ways. And if you like, I'll even give you a mental BJ with my mind from the lounge itself. Saucy. And I'll pop the links in the show notes. Thank you. Later. Amazing. All right, my love. Well, thank you so much for your time. I reckon we've done a pretty good job of, wrapping up the UTI topic for today. Is there anything else you feel like we haven't mentioned that's important to slip in before we close out the episode?
No, I tried to be cognizant of not repeating myself a lot in terms of the content that we had in that old episode. So if anyone is more curious about a deep dive into the vaginal microbiome, does that sound wrong?
Sounds good to me.
That's a visual, vivid image, isn't it? If you would like to take a deep dive into the vaginal microbiome, then go back and check out that episode, because we did cover stuff in a lot more detail. But I think we've done all right. Look at that, 1 hour and 10 minutes. I'm stopping talking now.
All right, amazing. Thanks, Joanna.
Bye-bye.
And that's it, darling hearts. Thanks for stopping by the Labia Lounge. Your bum groove in the couch will be right where you left it, just waiting for you to sink back in for some more double L action next time. If you'd be a dear and subscribe, share this episode, or leave a review on iTunes, then you can pat yourself on the snatch, because that's a downright act of sex-positive feminist activism, and you'd be supporting my vision to educate, empower, demystify and destigmatize with this here podcast. I'm also always open to feedback, topic ideas that you'd love to hear covered, questions or guest suggestions, so feel free to get in touch via my website or over on Insta. You can also send me in TMI stories to be shared anonymously on the pod. My handle is FreyaGraf_the Labia Lounge, if my account hasn't been deleted for being too sex positive, which, is always a possibility with censorship. But just in case the chronic censorship finally does obliterate my social channels, I'd highly recommend going and joining my mailing list and snagging yourself some fun freebies for the trouble at www.freyagraf.com/freebies. Anyway, later, labial legends. See you next time.